Good evening. I'm Rita Jacobs, a professor in the English department, and tonight I am so pleased to welcome you to the third annual Terhune Journalism Lecture. This event is funded by a grant from the Albert Payson Terhune Foundation, which we thank deeply. I don't know if anybody's here, and is co-sponsored this year by the MSU English Department and the School of Communication and Media. Briefly, for those of you who might not know about Albert Payson Terhune, who lived from 1872 to 1942 right here in Wayne, New Jersey, he was an author and a journalist, and he lived on his family's estate called Sunnybank, which is now a park in our area. And he was a famous breeder and raiser of collies. Normally, I wouldn't mention his avocation, but a great deal of Terhune's fame came from his stories and novels about his dogs. And last week, sitting in my office, I received a call from a 1951 graduate of Montclair State who had read every one of his books and wanted to know more about the lecture named for him. What I told her is what I'm about to tell you. With the assistance of the Terhune Foundation, we are proud to bring journalists to campus as models for our students. Tonight, we are especially pleased to have as our guest Ken Auletta, who has written the Annals of Communication column for The New Yorker since 1993. He's also written many books, including, and I have to turn a page, Greed and Glory on Wall Street, The Fall of the House of Lehman, the first major book presenting a gripping narrative of the inner workings of the business world. He's covered every aspect of media, television, newspapers, and all of the newer forms of media, including writing recent columns on Netflix and the digital revolution, and his book titled Googled, The End of the World as We Know It. He's a commentator on all things media, having interviewed and written about every important player in the media landscape. And he has frequently also been on the other side of the interview table as a guest on Charlie Rose and on other programs. Auletta has noted how difficult it is to define the current media climate because our confusion is abetted by the velocity of change. A big question that he has attempted to answer is what is a journalist to do in this age of uncertainty? His award-winning journalism provides at least one answer to that question. His writing is informative and provocative and is a true model for aspiring journalists. Tonight, Auletta is joined in conversation about the media revolution by Merrill Brown, the director of MSU's newly established School of Communication and Media. Merrill comes to us after a long career in journalism. His early years were spent at the Washington Post, and he has been a consultant and strategist for many media companies. In 1996, he became the first editor-in-chief of MSNBC.com, and since then has been involved with many print and online journalism ventures. Please welcome a New York Public Library literary lion, Ken Auletta, he promised to growl, who is our 2014 Terhune lecturer, and Merrill Brown.
Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Ken, for coming to Montclair, New Jersey, and to MSU tonight. I'm a judge of something called the Mirror Awards, which is a Syracuse University contest that awards the great journalism in media coverage every year. The awards have been around for about 8 years now, and every year I'm happy enough to judge the awards, and Ken Auletta gets one every single year. That's how distinguished and important he is. And we're pleased to have him here, in part because I'm tired of judging you, Ken. You're tired of this award, probably.
I'm tired of winning.
That is, they say, a good problem.
They give you a trophy. You have to carry home after lunch and you lug it.
So we're going to talk about a number of things today. Ken is writing extensively these days about the changes in the television business. He recently, just last month, wrote a groundbreaking piece about Netflix and how important the Netflix phenomena is to digital television. He's written extensively about the future of journalism. We'll talk about that as well. And we'll talk a little bit about Ken and how you get to be Ken Auletta. But let's dive right into television, which is a topic on lots of people's minds who are tracking the media these days. Your piece in Netflix suggested, but didn't necessarily conclude, that we're in for a dramatic period of change, and in some way hinted at we ain't seen nothing yet. What do you take away from your Netflix experience?
I take away that I wrote a book in 91 called Three Blind Mice, How the TV Networks Lost Their Way. And I made the argument in that book that the three networks, and that Fox had just come on in 86, so it became fourth network. But the argument I made is that they were challenged by the new technology then, which was cable. And the problem that the broadcast networks had is that they were reliant on a single source of revenue, which was advertising. And unless they had other sources of revenue, they were in trouble, like Three Blind Mice. And what happened subsequent to that is that they got other sources of revenue, something called retransmission consent, which happened in 92, the year after my book came out. Then they got some rights to own and sell programming, which created, and then they got new platforms like Netflix and Amazon and iTunes. So suddenly the networks were making money on that. But the networks, along comes Netflix, which is a friend of theirs in that it's a new platform that supplies them money. Last year, CBS and Fox each got $250 million from Netflix. So that's, hey, they're our friend, we like that. On the other hand, if you're watching Netflix, you're not watching ads. So you're accustoming people to say, hey, I don't have to watch ads. A. B, if you're watching Netflix, an hour show on Netflix is 1 hour. No commercial interruptions. If you watch, as I recently did, binge watched Friday Night Lights. How many of you have ever seen Friday Night Lights? It's a great show, right? And 42 minutes. So if you're a writer, you say, what would I rather be writing? An hour or 42 minutes, A. And B, would I rather be writing a show that people could watch like they read a book, more than one chapter at a time, which is what you could do on Netflix. And then if you go to technology and you ask Nielsen, or you ask better yet TiVo, which has even better numbers than Nielsen does, if you own a TiVo box, 62% of the people who own a TiVo box are skipping the ads. They're not watching the ads. And 52% who, according to Nielsen, are not watching the ads. So when you spin out the future, to your question about Netflix, you say, oh my God, this is a real problem for the networks, but not just for the networks, for cable as well, because cable networks have as many, if not more, ads sometimes than broadcast networks. So cable's answer to that is to say, we're going to give you something called video on demand. And you've all heard that, and you'll be offered that, and they'll say, you can watch a library of past shows. Won't you like that? But the give is that in order to do that, you have to watch the commercials. You can't skip them. So a basic question is, did that young person brought up on Netflix, and the average age of a Netflix viewer is much younger than the average age of a broadcast or cable viewer, and the average age of a YouTube viewer is even younger than that. Did those viewers who were accustomed to not watching ads, are they going to, in 10 years, be watching ads? Or are they going to be just, as Nielsen said, the head of Nielsen Research said to me, are they going to be just like their parents and become accustomed to ads? My guess is they won't be. And if they're not, that's a huge source of revenue for cable networks and for broadcast networks. And therefore, it's very disruptive of television.
Well, we're cutting to the chase very quickly, but extrapolate from all that. What does it mean? You also note in that piece that CBS has never made more money. Now, presumably they're doing it on the backs of your peer group, older people, but they're also...
Thank you. I thought he was my host.
No, I'm your provocateur. But on the other hand, they seem to have a bright future measured by stock price and so on and so forth. So how do you explain the success of the conventional against this backdrop?
I think unlike newspapers, unlike the music business, the television business has done a better job of forestalling the digital revolution. And they have survived a longer period of time. Newspapers are, as my friend Marty Gottlieb, who's the editor of the a major paper in New Jersey, knows full well. I mean, we're all challenged in the print business, and not just newspapers, but magazines as well. And television, in part because they have these new platforms to sell to, like Netflix and iTunes, and in part because they own and can sell overseas. I mean, last year CBS alone generated $1.2 billion of sales of programming overseas. That's something that didn't exist 20 years ago. So that's a plus for them. But if you extrapolate in the future, way beyond the next year or two or three, you have to say that the CBSs of this world will be challenged. And at some point, if it starts hitting their stock price, where people think that's not a growth business, they're in more trouble.
Here at our school, though, we see a lot of this as a great creative opportunity. It's also noted in your story that people watching Netflix television episodes watch 2.5 of those episodes, so the storyline gets to extend itself. And there's a whole new way of storytelling that this phenomena has encouraged, making television very hot in many ways, and film people now very interested in being in television. So great opportunity, right?
Oh, no question. I mean, and again, go back to the point I was making about a 60-minute episode on Netflix versus 42 minutes on broadcast or cable network. If you're a creative person, you say this is a much more attractive venue. So one of the reasons you see talented people who used to want to gravitate to the movie business want to gravitate to television is exactly that. And we have John Auletta in the audience here, who has a series on Amazon, and that's one of the attractions. He and Mr. Trudeau had created that series, and it's done very well, in part because it's an attractive to do that. Would you rather do that or write a sitcom where basically, in a half-hour sitcom, 19 minutes is what you get, and the rest is ads.
So this is the good news about television, a new creative opportunity. The bad news is challenged business model for some people in it.
There's another bad news, which is something that the digital companies don't always want to recognize. If you have a show like, how many people here watch The Good Wife on CBS? Do you agree with me? It's a really terrific show and a really shocking last episode. Yeah. I won't tell you in case you haven't seen it. But here's a show that costs $4 to $5 million an episode. That's very expensive. If, in fact, CBS's business is challenged and they have less revenues coming in, how are they going to be able to afford to make a quality program like that? That's a real issue, and that's one that affects every one of us here, because we care about that. I would argue, again, part of the television landscape, television is better today than it's ever been, and the choices are vast. I know all the complaints, the Springsteen song about 500 channels and nothing to watch. I think that's crap. I think there's a lot of really good stuff on television. My wife and I literally just binged on Netflix 76 episodes, not consecutively, I might add. I have to go to the bathroom a little bit, but 76 episodes of Friday Night Lights. I mean, it's sensational. And that was started on NBC 7 years ago.
Then migrated, ironically, to DirecTV of all places, right?
DirecTV took it, it's last year, its 4th season, and now Netflix has it. And one of the things that's very exciting about this new world, you look at Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad was a show that didn't have any traction its first 2 years, had a very small audience for AMC, which is a cable network. And then it's picked up by places like Netflix, and suddenly the echo chamber and the viral effect of that, the last episode of Breaking Bad was watched by a total of 15 million viewers. And not all of them watching that night, they were watching it over the same period of time. So that's a very exciting thing about how a Netflix can help a cable or broadcast networks and bring a larger audience. But even when you bring a larger audience, you got to think about what's the economics. Can you continue to afford to create some of these quality programs? And that's an issue for the future too.
An issue for the future is also the fact that the cable industry thinks it needs to consolidate in the face of all these threats. You apparently think the merger among the two largest cable operators is a bad idea. You alluded to that in a piece. I'm not sure it's a bad idea. You're convinced. I in fact think the
I'm
government
not convinced.
government can extract some pretty good things out of these folks.
Well, they have before. I mean, when Comcast bought NBC, they insisted that Comcast give good space to some of the other news channels that competed with MSNBC and NBC, and that's a useful thing for government to be doing. I don't know whether I'm not convinced it's a bad thing, so that's a little too strong. I am worried for the following reason. Television is migrating to the internet. You're going to be watching television over an internet connection in the future. That's clear. That's what Netflix is today. That's what Amazon is today. That's what iTunes is. And that will increasingly happen. Who owns the platform to allow you to watch over the internet? The cable companies, the broadband supplier. Now, the telephone company also supplies broadband, and hopefully one day technology will allow for wireless broadband to be as good as fiber is. But one of the worries you have, if in fact cable is a monopoly providing broadband, and if in fact television is delivered over the internet, then what's to stop those cable broadband suppliers or Fios, which is owned by Verizon, from saying, hey, you know, we're going to do exactly what electricity companies do. We're going to meter your usage. So if you watch more television, we're going to charge you more. And that raises some big questions, you know, in the future, and something where you want government to be watching, and watching that kind of power is not abused.
But what about bigger in cable television is necessarily bad? You could argue more resources, better technology, more ability to make interesting programming, et cetera.
Look, you know, and one of the reasons why I'm not certain what the right answer is if you look at the negotiations that took place this past summer between Time Warner and CBS. Time Warner said CBS went to Time Warner and they said, we want you to pay more for what's called retransmission consent, which is, what it is simply put, is that cable companies pay broadcasters money in order to carry broadcast channels. And so, as I said, they paid CBS $250 million last year. CBS went to them and said, we want you to pay more. They say, you're holding us up. We can't afford that. And the truth is the cable companies, their real profit margins come from broadband, not from video, because they're paying such steep prices for what's called retransmission consent. So they said, you know, we're not going to pay it. So CBS went black. You didn't watch CBS for roughly 5 weeks on Time Warner Cable until the football season was about to start. And what happened? Time Warner caved. Time Warner caved to the greater power, which was CBS. So here cable, which, you know, some people would argue is a monopoly, they didn't act like a monopoly in that case. They were the weaker party. CBS was the stronger party. And if you talk about ESPN, which basically costs everyone in this room, if you have a cable subscription, about $6 or $7 just for ESPN, even if you don't watch it.
And it's many
It's part
offshoots.
of your cable bill.
And
right.
it's many offshoots.
And it's many offshoots. So ESPN has enormous sway over the cable companies. So on the one hand, you could argue they're a monopoly in terms of distribution of broadband. On the other hand, they're not a monopoly in terms of their power over programmers. So it's a world that's really complicated, and there's no, which is one of the reasons why I say I don't have a simple answer as to whether cable is a monopoly. But cable is a monopoly in your local area. I mean, you only get Time Warner or Comcast in certain areas, or Charter or whatever in certain areas, or Cablevision, whatever. And yes, you can go to a telephone company, or you can go to satellite, and those are competition. But if the worry is that cable is now split up into roughly 7 different huge, large cable companies, there are a few more than that, but basically 7 large ones, and each of them have their own dish. They don't compete with each other. But they are competed against by DirecTV or Echo, Dish Network, or by, in some cases, by AT&T and Verizon Fios. So there is competition in that, but the worry is that if Comcast acquires, and it's approved, their acquisition of Time Warner, They will have 30% of all the cable homes, but they'll have 40% of all the broadband homes. 40% is a pretty large number for broadband, particularly if you think about television moving to the internet.
Fair points. You mentioned sports as what decided the CBS Time Warner standoff. And sports is really important these days. We seem to have unlimited money, unlimited time, unlimited television time for sports these days. Everybody feels like they have to have a sports cable network. Probably few people in this room know there's a cable network called NBC Sports Cable, another one called CBS Sports Cable. It's on our cable systems. They're spending probably considerable money on that, not as much as Fox, who's spending $1 billion to have a sports network to compete with ESPN. What's going on here?
Well, actually, sports is really an interesting. Sports it's a guaranteed male audience, and it's an audience where people do watch the ads mostly because the ads tend to be better. Witness Super Bowl ads, though I didn't think they were so good this year. But in any case, one of the interesting future issues that relates to sports, in broadcast, you watch sports for free. Super Bowl is on a network and it's for free. One of the things that the broadcast networks are threatening in the future is if, in fact, a new technology called Aereo comes into being. Aereo is something where this digital company says basically we will create in the cloud, on our servers, we will tape all of the broadcast shows, and for roughly $10 to $12 a month, you can have this little antenna the size of a dime in your house, and you can watch broadcast shows for that. If that happens, that really puts a crimp in the broadcast business. It also puts a crimp in the cable business because cable people or Netflix, other platforms are going to say, why am I paying all this money to CBS, NBC, ABC, and Fox for broadcast programs that people are watching on this new technology called Aereo, which, by the way, is before the Supreme Court this term, and in 2 previous court cases, Aereo has won. So there's a real chance they will win on the Supreme Court by July. If that happens, that is incredibly disruptive. What do the networks say? This goes back to your question about sports. The networks then say, hey, if that happens, we'll become a cable network. Well, if they become a cable network, they're going to charge you to watch. Therefore, the end of free sports on television, if that happens. Will Congress allow that? A basic question. You know, television over the air for free was supposed to be that you didn't pay out of your own pocket, you paid by watching the advertising. But if people are skipping the ads increasingly, which they are, and advertisers are much too slow to catch up to that trick, and if in fact they turn to Aereo, which is deemed, if it's deemed legal, are they going to allow them to become a cable network and no more basically free television? You'll have to subscribe. It's one of the big issues out there, and by the way, it's going to come to a head this year. And
there's no sign of a slowing marketplace in any way whatsoever when it comes to sports and sports rights, right? Seems infinite.
Sports rights is growing dramatically, and it's one area where companies like Netflix, which compete when they do House of Cards, they're competing by creating alternate programming, or HBO with its programming. None of them, I mean, as the head of Netflix said to me, he said, I can afford to pay for badminton. I can't pay $1 billion plus for NFL rights for football games. And so that's something that even ABC, which owns ESPN, they don't have that kind of sports anymore. It's on ESPN. You have to have a cable subscription to see it.
Was he actually threatening to go get a bunch of minor sports and make that an important thing on Netflix?
No. He basically has said, Reed Hastings, the founder and head of Netflix, said that we're not interested in being in the sports business or the news business.
Well, another good segue. We should talk about news a little bit. News is changing. You write about it all the time, although you seem quite focused on digital television and all those changes these days. How do you look at the news business in broad terms today? Are you fearful about the implications of the death of the local daily newspaper? Are you worried about the fact that broadcast networks aren't what they used to be when you were writing about Three Blind Mice? How do you look at where news is going?
Yes and yes. I think that broadcast television is, I mean, just look at the morning shows. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to watch the news on that, though I must say CBS Morning is a more serious morning show than, and they've stuck to that, and I applaud that. But generally speaking, the news on network television is overly dominated by health, which appeals, they think, to women, and weather, which they think appeals to everybody. Local TV news is often, I think, an embarrassment. I mean, print, you look at the shrinkage of newspapers and reporting, and how so many newspapers don't cover state capitals and city halls. And investigative reporting is deemed to be inefficient because it's expensive, and because in the digital world you can tell who's reading what, and you know the people are not reading with the frequency those investigative reports, which are really important, but don't achieve the same kind of audience that Kim Kardashian does. Even Vogue put her on the cover, which really shocked me. I mean, actually, I wonder what impact that will have on the Vogue brand, as they say.
And newsstand sales, we'll see.
And yeah, I'm kind of curious about that. But I mean, so I worry about news. On the other hand, there are hopeful signs about news. I mean, the fact that Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post, which was in decline financially and really in great trouble, and the Graham family, which believed in it, and I think are really public-spirited citizens, they said, we can't continue to do this, and they sold to someone who hopefully will treat it, he only paid $250 million, and Lord knows he can afford that, but hopefully will treat it like a grand experiment. And who better to experiment in the digital world than Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. So I'm hopeful about that. When I see that Pierre Omidyar has bought, you know, First Look, a digital company to do investigative reporting, and is not interested in profit, it's a nonprofit effort to try and do that. Or you see ProPublica, which is supported by business donations, basically, a philanthropic effort. It's a nonprofit doing important investigative work. I mean, those are exciting things going on. And when you see the New York Times website, NewYorkTimes.com, growing and a rather large digital subscriber base, almost 700,000 subscribers. The problem, and I have to come back to the problem because, I mean, I think you have to look at economics and not just talk about the wonderful things that are going on and the great experiments being done. But one of the problems economically is that the average reader of the New York Times newspaper spends roughly 30 minutes a day reading the New York Times. That's a lot. But the average reader of the New York Times online spends roughly 30 minutes a month. Now think about that, what that means. That means that if you're an advertiser, and online, so much your income is coming from advertising. You're an advertiser, you're saying, I will not pay the same amount for an ad in the online New York Times as I pay for an ad in the newspaper New York Times. Because I know in the newspaper, people are going to spend more time with seeing my ad than they are when they're only spending 30 minutes a month on time. So what does that mean? That means that the average ad in the online New York Times gets 1/10 of the revenue that the average ad in the newspaper gets, 1/10. So one of the things you see is that though the digital readership of the New York Times and subscription base for digital is growing and has grown very impressively, and it's a great product, but the revenue has not grown that way. And the New York Times is still a challenge. I think the greatest newspaper in the world is still a challenged business. And that's worrisome for those of us. I mean, the New York Times, I remember a couple of years ago I was doing a piece on the Times, and they were spending $5 million a year on covering just 2 countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. $5 million a year. I mean, that's extraordinary. And the question is, in the future, can you continue to afford that. It's important that they do, because Huffington Post is not doing that. BuzzFeed is not doing that. None of these websites, Yahoo is not doing that. And that's something that matters to all of us as citizens.
In New Jersey, as you and I have discussed, we're trying here at Montclair State to do what we can to help support the development of a media ecosystem that will cover New Jersey and provide its citizens with news and information. The newspapers here in New Jersey are getting a lot of attention because of their high-quality work around the Christie matter right now. But
broken by that man right there.
Piece of it broken by the Record, of course.
That's my, hold up your hand, Marty, so I can see. That's
editor of the Record. Thanks for coming. But today, the Newhouses, who own the Newark newspaper, announced that they're consolidating everything they have in New Jersey, which is multiple products, into one company to be called NJ Advanced Media. This includes editorial, this includes marketing, this includes advertising. They are shrinking even further, and this is going to yield lots of layoffs as media in New Jersey gets even more concentrated and limited. How do you react to that kind of thing?
Not good. I mean, I find it depressing. And you know, they had Newhouse, which has owned papers all over the country. I mean, they cut back the days of publication for the New Orleans Picayune Times, a very good newspaper. But what they're saying is, and this is common among newspaper owners, unless you're Warren Buffett, who has been buying newspapers, but there's a difference, and I'll come to that in 1 second if I can. What the Newhouse family, by the way, they own my magazine, The New Yorker.
Bless them.
And I would for that, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily for the newspaper thing. But the problem that they have, and newspaper owners have, is that if they're losing money, or their profit margin is so small that they're a privately held company, not a public company, but a lot of the newspaper companies are public companies, their stock price takes this enormous hit. So they say, what do I do? I can't afford to do this. There are many people who feel, certainly in the stock market, and the Sulzberger family resists this, and you know, I applaud them for it, but it's still problematic. They say, you can't afford a newsroom with 1,100 people worldwide, which is what the New York Times newsroom is. And there are many people who feel that at some point the Times is going to have to cut back, as the Washington Post did, as the LA Times did, as many other newspapers, including, as you're suggesting today, I hadn't known that statement, that the Newhouses did here. It is worrisome, but it's a reflection of the reality that people are getting their news in different ways today, and therefore not as dependent on print newspapers. And the digital newspaper that replaces it hasn't found an economic way to be sustained. Now, Warren Buffett has bought roughly 90 newspapers, and here's a guy who didn't believe in newspapers at one point. Why is he doing that? He's buying them in small communities where they're monopoly newspapers, and they still make, you know, the roughly 10% profit margin. There was one point where papers like USA Today, the Gannett chain, which owned USA Today, but owns many more papers, their profit margins were in the 30s, 30%. It means if every dollar, over 30 cents of each dollar was a profit, that's enormous. That's like Microsoft profits or Google profits. And now in the newspaper business, you're down, in some cases, to losses, but in many other cases, profit margins of 3 or 4%.
But America's preeminent investor, Warren Buffett, is buying newspapers. Local television stations are selling at extraordinary prices. Gannett stock is way up. Are we about to see something happen here that maybe will get to some of your concerns?
Well, let's disaggregate what you said. Let's look at local news. Okay. Do you see any evidence that local news is getting better?
I see some evidence that local television is getting more profitable.
That's not the same thing.
No, it's not.
Okay. And what you see is increasingly you see what happened in radio is happening in local television, which is you're pooling news sources in order to save money and cut down on the number of reporters doing stories. How many stories do you read? When you watch local television, most of the stories would seem to me to be about traffic, weather, and some kind of fire or crisis. You see very little coverage of state government or city government.
And never have, by and large.
Well, you saw more of it at one point. No, you did see more of it at one point than you do today. And so the trend line for me in terms of local news coverage is I find fairly depressing. I'm not making a uniform statement, but in general, that's a generalization I would make. But Buffett he's buying monopoly newspapers, and monopolies are all, if you don't have competition, or your only competition is digital, but you're in a small town and the digital competition.
But there are no more afternoon papers. There's no more competition. Almost every market is a monopoly in some form or another, right?
Not necessarily.
Newark Star Ledger is the only newspaper in
yeah, it is, but you
Newark.
have first. I think there's a difference between a small town in Oklahoma with a newspaper, where that paper is ingrained in somehow in that community, and the Newark Star Ledger in Newark. I mean, I just think
Buffett bought Richmond, Virginia, and Tampa, Florida, not community newspaper, tiny towns. He seems to know something.
Well, he reads a balance sheet. He says 10, 12% profit margin. I like that. And maybe also there's real estate involved, and I like that. So he's just looking at the numbers. He's not saying, I believe in newspapers. I mean, he's a guy who basically said for years he didn't believe in newspapers and sold his interest in the Washington Post. But he's just looking at a business opportunity. He's not doing it to advance the cause of journalism. I mean, he's a wonderful investor, but he's doing it as an investor. So it's a business decision.
So you don't think he's doing it as a philanthropist? He's doing it as an investor?
No, people approached him for years. Buy the Washington Post as a philanthropic effort. He refused.
So what should we take away about the glories of the news future? You know, Henry Blodgett, who founded Business Insider, thinks the glory days are ahead of us. People like the Washington Post's Ezra Klein and the New York Times' Nate Silver are going off and starting new ventures because they have a special expertise. In the case of Klein, public policy. In the case of Silver, data and data mining. Are there great opportunities like that, or are we in a little bit of a fantasy bubble right now?
We don't know. I mean, I'm thrilled to watch it happen, and the people are going out there and throwing stuff up against the wall and seeing what sticks, but we don't know yet what's going to stick. But that they're willing to do it is great. I mean, Henry Blodgett with the Business Insider, he has a reporting staff probably of 70 people today. Vox, and ESPN, which bought Silver's company. I mean, that's great that they're doing that, but we don't know. It's great that Pierre Omidyar is doing what he's doing. Jeff Bezos is doing what he's doing. But we don't yet know what the success of those efforts will be. But hopefully, the hope is that these digital experiments will figure out a way to save not just the New York Times, but other good journalism. But one of the worries I have, and this is just, again, I tend to see things in grays, not black and whites here. One of the worries is that when you have business people who have green eye shades, and they could see in the digital world, which they can see, who is reading what and who is not reading what, there will be a natural tendency for those business people who are not journalists, who don't speak or don't share the religion of the public's right to know, which is the mumbo jumbo you'll hear from journalists like me and like you, that they will say, why are we doing these investigative reports? Why are we covering the state capitol? No one, look, there's no traffic. No one wants to read that crap. And that's the downside of the digital revolution. The plus side is that if you read, say, the New York Times online, I mean, you can go back, you're reading a story, you can go back and read other stories on that. You can go back and watch video. I mean, it's fantastic, the opportunities and that it opens to you as a consumer of news. And I think that's fantastic.
You've written a lot about social media, and you've written a book about Google. You're quite aware of the phenomena in that world as well, and yet you've, it seems, gone out of your way to avoid it yourself. You have no presence on Twitter to speak of. I don't believe you.
Facebook.
Oh, I believe you don't have a Facebook page.
I do, but I don't use it.
I think you posted.
Same with Twitter.
I think you posted last in '09 in Facebook.
Yeah, when I had a book coming out.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So, obviously, it's an important phenomenon. Everyone in this room is
Why am I not doing
phased
it?
by it. Why are you so indifferent to it when it seems so important?
I'm not actually indifferent. I have an opinion. And the opinion is that I'm anal.
Good to know.
Which means that I am, if you write me, I write back. And my wife calls me anal. And the worry, I don't have time. I don't have time to, I want to read, I want to report, I want to write, I want to cook, I want to spend some time with family and friends. If I'm on Facebook or tweeting, I don't have time to do that. I don't have time to tell you. And I don't think it's that interesting for me to tell you that, you know, I just finished a piece for the New Yorker today, or I had filet mignon for dinner tonight, or whatever. I mean, I watch these people on network TV, and they say, you know, I'm tweeting, or I mean, I just find that I would find that an unbelievable waste of my time. And if I start engaging where people are communicating with me, I would feel an obligation to communicate back. And I don't have time.
Yet, the business you're in is full of people who think it's important to their brand development, important to be talking to their audiences,
Right.
important to get feedback from them. I know you care about feedback from the audience, although you don't like this vehicle, apparently. What do you make of all that? I mean, is this a waste of their time, too?
No, I don't judge them. I'm judging myself. This is what I'm choosing what I want to do. I don't want to spend my time self-promoting myself, A. I don't have time to write back, to be in a dialogue with people. I don't have time to be in a dialogue with too many of my friends right now, or not enough to my satisfaction. So for me, it is not something I choose to do. If they choose to do it, great. And do I see benefits to doing it? Of course. Are you getting more feedback from your readers and maybe learning things that I'm not learning? Maybe. But for me, the negatives in this case outweigh the positives.
So where do these social media services fit into the future of news, even if whatever that fit is will happen without you?
Huge. I mean, I think it's huge I mean, you see increasingly people are getting their news from Twitter feeds. And from friends on Facebook who are sending them links to things that they read. I mean, Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, said to me he doesn't read newspapers. He reads what his friends send him, the links they send him. And I think increasingly that happens.
I'd love to get some links from you. I'm complaining about this. I'd like to. I don't care what you ate, but I'd love to know what you read this morning.
So tweet me and I won't read it.
I know, okay.
I mean, I read 5-6 newspapers a day. I spend an enormous amount of time reading stuff online.
But you won't share that with me or with the room here.
Well, if you email me what are sites I get, I'll email you back.
And I'll share it. I'll retweet it. And so
I'll be your
Twitter baby.
Whatever makes you happy.
Okay. No, but seriously, let's talk for a minute about the importance of all this. It is important. It goes beyond sharing. It's about dialogue. It's about even new forms of journalism, right?
Totally. I mean, I'm just talking about what I made a judgment I have time to do. That is not to cast aspersions on social networks and the value that people gain from them. I don't make that judgment at all.
And their
Quite
importance
the opposite,
in the media future, right?
Totally. And but their importance and some worries about that too. I mean, I don't like the idea. I mean, let me tell you a story that goes to the heart of this part of the question you're asking. What worries me is that I don't like hearing what Eric Schmidt said, that he only reads what friends sent him. And let me go back. In '95, I was interviewing Andy Grove, who was then the CEO and chairman of Intel, and one of the great pioneers in the digital world, and a legendary figure. And there were 1,000 newspaper editors in this room in Dallas, and I said to Grove, and I knew he would do this. This is like the third or fourth year of the internet, so the internet was in its infancy then. And I said, Mr. Grove, in the future, what's the value of these 1,000 editors in this room, newspaper editors. And he looked at the audience with a little smirk on his face and he said, 0. I said, why? He said, because in the future, I can create the Andy Grove newspaper, the things I want to read. I'm interested in health, I'm interested in sports, I'm interested in business. I could just have those things that interest me, that I know interest me, pushed to me. Everyone in that audience of editors sunk lower in their seats, as you would expect they would. 2 years later, at a conference, I'm interviewing Mr. Grove again. And I quote him what he had said to me 2 years before. And I said, Mr. Grove, do you still agree with what you told me in Dallas? And he said, no, I was wrong. I said, really, why? He said, because I didn't understand the importance of a curation, of an editor sorting out for me what was important to read. I didn't know then that Sarajevo would happen. I didn't know then that Rwanda would happen, and that these were things I as a citizen needed to know. But I wouldn't have known it just by reading what was pushed to me. I needed someone telling me, which is what an editor does. This is Grove talking. I needed someone telling me what was important and what wasn't, what I needed to know as a citizen. So that's why I feel uncomfortable when I hear Eric Schmidt, who's a very intelligent man, say he just gets his news from links that his friend sends. And that's the importance of people like Marty Gottlieb, an editor, a curator, an intelligent agent. And the other thing Grove said to me is he said, I didn't understand how much information was out there and how little time I had to sort it out in the internet world, and therefore I needed that curation or editing.
The curation you perform for all of us is by deciding what topics you want to weigh in on. That's a very hard decision you make with every story because you make a major commitment to it. What topics do you see on the horizon for you over the next year or two?
Well, first of all, I don't make it alone. I mean, the New Yorker is the great thing about, one of the great things about the New Yorker for a writer is that they don't assign you. You have to want to do a piece. But sometimes they suggest a piece to you, and certainly no, you don't do any piece unless the editor approves doing that piece. The answer to your question is I won't answer your question because, you know, I don't know any journalist who would tell the truth about what they're working on when it hasn't appeared yet, for obvious reasons.
High-level topics. Are you focusing on digital these days? Are you?
Right now, the piece I'm working on now is digital touches on it, but it's not a digital story. It's a story about impact of the press, though.
What does it take to get a job that good, where you can write almost whatever you want as infrequently as you wish?
Well, you know, the truth is, I often think that I should be paying the New Yorker to be doing what I do. It's a great. Don't you agree, John? It's a great life. But people, why are people paying us to do this, right?
But seriously, you get to do this with not a great deal of frequency. You're not in the magazine every week or even close. How does that come about, and how did that evolve as the annals of communication, the heading over your columns came to be?
Well, what happened was I had written for the New Yorker before, my first piece in the New Yorker was in '78, and it was I mostly did political stuff. I did a two-part profile of Mayor Koch's first year, a two-part profile of Governor Cuomo his first year as governor, did a three-part series on poverty in America, did a number of things, and then I went off on a book leave to do Three Blind Mice, and actually wound up spending 6 years on that. And so I was away from the New Yorker in that period of time, and in that period of time there was turmoil there, and the editor who replaced Mr. Shawn, who I had worked with, was Bob Gottlieb, and then he was ousted in '91, and Tina Brown came in. And this was the year Three Blind Mice came out, and there was a dinner held for her by the Newhouses, and I was invited, I don't know why, but I was seated next to her, and she said to me at dinner, would you come and write Annals of Entertainment for me at the New Yorker, which I'm taking over? And I said, no. I said, I want to go do biography, which I had never done before. And I said, but you're thinking about it wrong. one of the things I learned from doing Three Blind Mice, which was a media book about how technology was disrupting traditional television, in this case the technology was cable, I said, the world is changing so fast, and companies like Microsoft are investing in the movie business right now, and all these companies are publishing companies were doing CD-ROMs. I mean, everything was kind of merging together, and so it's really should be annals of communication, not entertainment. She said, "Would you do it?" And I said, "No, and I'm going to Italy on vacation in 2 days, but thank you anyway." She said, "Would you just see me tomorrow and just talk about it?" So I saw her the next day, and I still said no. But then I went to Italy and was eating pasta, a lot of it, and I thought about it, and I said, this might be fun. And I came back, and I said to her, "I will do it, but these are the addition to the money question, which resolved. I said, I want the following. I said, I would like to have 4 to 5 months just to go out and talk to people on a background basis, which means I can take my notepad, but I couldn't quote them by name. And I want to go see 40, 50, 60 people and find out what's going on in the future, what they worry about, what they lose sleep over, and not write anything for 4 to 5 months." And she agreed, which was extraordinary. And that 4 to 5 months that I spent out there, I probably got 10 story ideas out of that from people. It was one of the most productive things I've ever done. And then the New Yorker is just an idyllic place that gives you the time and the space. So I liken what I do to visiting planets. I'm going to go visit Planet Google, or Planet Netflix, and I'm going to really immerse myself for several months, in Google's case, several years, and try and understand the natives, who they are, what they do, what the culture is, what is peculiar to it, and then have the luxury of time to figure it out and write about it. And that's something that's rare in the journalism world. In fact, one of the weaknesses of journalism, and it's worsened by the digital world, which speeds everything up, is that you don't have time to reflect and to write and to understand what's going on. And that's a real negative.
And as you look back on it, share with us, who were the couple of most interesting people you encountered or profiled? You wrote a book on involving Turner at one point, an interesting figure. You've known Gates for better or for worse over the years. Who's really stimulated you?
Well, Ted Turner was a fascinating character to spend time with. I was walking down the street with him once, and he created CNN and Turner Broadcasting and Cartoon Network, TNT, etc. And a great character. Was married to Jane Fonda for a period of time. We're walking down the street, and he was on the cover of a magazine, and he held it up to the sky, and he said, "Is this enough for you, Dad?" Holding up for his father, who's dead. Well, how did his father die? And he described what happened to me. His father owned the largest billboard company in the South and didn't own any television stations or anything else. And Ted was 25 years old, and his father, they had breakfast one morning, and then his father went upstairs, and Ted heard a gunshot. And he and his mother ran upstairs, and his father had committed suicide. But he left a note. And the note was to his best friend, and the note said, "I want you to sell my company because I don't think my son Ted is capable of running it." So this is the cross that Ted Turner bore, and that's why he held this cover of the magazine up to the sky to prove to his father he was worthy. And what did Ted Turner do? Ted Turner went out and not only had the paper ripped up from the friend not to sell it, he expanded the billboard company. He bought a local TV station. He turned it into the first superstation. He bought the sports right to the Atlanta basketball team. And suddenly he's built this empire, then CNN and everything else, and very successful. He was a fascinating guy. And I remember I spent a lot of time with him, but I regret I didn't do this, but he said, "You want to come hunting with me today?" And I actually don't want to go hunting, so I didn't do it. But I actually think the piece, which I was happy with, would have been even better had I gone hunting with him.
Who else? How about the Google founders or somebody from the brave new world we're in today that's striking to you?
Well, Sheryl Sandberg is striking to me. I profiled her. She's the one who wrote Lean In, which is still on the bestseller list for a year now. And she's the #2 at Facebook. I had met her when she was head of sales at Google. She's a fascinating character, very able person. She's 44 years old. She may well at one point run for political office. She was chief of staff to the Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration in her 30s, early 30s. And one day she'll either be a CEO of a company. She's actually been mentioned as a possible CEO to succeed Bob Iger at Disney. She's on the board of Disney. She's a fascinating character. Rupert Murdoch's a fascinating character. I mean, I spent 5 months doing a profile of him in '95. He's not a particularly introspective man, and I abhor what he does journalistically, which he knew. But I think as a businessman, he's really a bold, interesting character who makes big bets. And you know, when you spend time, one of the things that's really interesting when you spend a lot of time with people to get inside them is that, you know, they think you like them. Not because you tell them you like them, not because you applaud them in any way or give them advice in any way. I don't. And I try and call them Mr., by the way, unless it becomes too obvious. It creates a wall between us. You don't want to create a wall because you want to get inside and in their head and understand them and almost become like a shrink to them if they're opening up. But what happens is they expect that they're going to like the piece. They've been with you for 5 months. There's been no negative repercussions. You don't talk to anyone. You don't print anything about them. So you keep their confidence. That gives them more confidence, right? And then the piece comes out and, oh my God, they're not happy and they feel betrayed. This is not unusual. It happens a lot. And it certainly happened with Murdoch, who still to this day doesn't talk to me. And it's one of the interesting things about journalism that I know my friend John has this when he writes about President Obama, as he's written, that people open up and they think you're going to write something good, and then if you write something they don't like, they feel betrayed. And that's the word they will use. And it's a very hurtful word to a journalist because betrayal means that did I lie? Did I take something off the record and put it on the record? No, but so it's a misnomer. They shouldn't be using that term, but nevertheless, it's emotional, and that's how they feel. They feel betrayed by someone that they open themselves to for a period of time. And one of the reasons why, just to end this little story, one of the reasons why I often think, I was in politics when I was a young man, and worked for Bobby Kennedy the year he was shot. And one of the comeaways that I've had when I compare politics and journalism, I think that journalism in some ways is more ruthless than politics, because you have to be ruthless to sit there and know that you're taking a shot at someone. And politics is often about loyalties too, to people who supported you. And you know, I didn't run for office. I was a handler, a speechwriter and stuff. But a politician has loyalties. A journalist doesn't have loyalties, or is not supposed to have loyalties. You're supposed to be loyal to the reader, to give the reader what you think is the truth. And that often means that the people who've cooperated with you feel that you've hurt them.
And you make your peace with that because it's comes with the territory.
Yeah, I mean, I admire Bill Gates, and particularly what he's done with his charitable efforts. Bill Gates saw me; he'd like to kill me.
Why is that?
Well, I wrote a book about him. I covered the Microsoft trial, antitrust trial, and wrote a book, and basically portrayed him as a child, which he was.
Which he is.
I mean, he could have avoided that antitrust trial, which he lost, had he been a grown-up. But he was too proud to admit or to settle. He wanted to win. And it was a mistake on his part. And I actually begin the book with a scene between he and I at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where I asked him, I said, Mr. Gates, this was a room full of about 100 journalists and editors. It was a lunch, and I raised my hand, and I said, and I knew him reasonably well from covering Microsoft over the years and having interviewed him a number of times, and I said, Mr. Gates, what do you say to those who say Microsoft is arrogant? This is 99, this is just before the antitrust trial, which was late 99 and into 2000. And he suddenly exploded on stage, and all the editors and reporters in this room were looking at each other and said, oh my God, what is going on? This Bill Gates, why is he acting like he's doing this histrionic fit here? So he came back to the table, it was a lunch, and I was seated at his table because I knew him, and there were a number of other people. There's some editors, the editor of Wall Street Journal was at the table, the head of Coca-Cola was at the table, and Gates stood over me and started screaming at me. And the people, this is a lunch, there may be 10 tables, and he said, and then he finally said, what should I do, Ken? What should I do? And I said, Bill, that's above my pay grade. I'm a journalist. I don't know what you should do. But anyway, I wrote this scene as the opening scene of my book. And you can understand why he would be upset by that. And I do understand that. But it's a great scene, I thought.
No question.
Pretty ruthless, right?
We're going to take a few questions from the audience in just a minute, so ready them. There's a woman in the back with a microphone, and she'll come down and see you if you'll raise your hand. We'll just want to ask Ken one more question before we get to you all. So there is this body of work. Occasionally you dabble into other things, still politics. You wrote about the end of the era of Mayor Bloomberg not too long ago. What do you think about this body of work and your devotion to this issue as you look back on it?
Communications?
Communications. Do you wish you had gone off and covered wars at some point? Do you wish you had written about economic policy, or has this been, sort of a journalist fantasy?
I started, I have a graduate degree in political science, and I thought I would be, my journalistic career, I said I worked in government and politics the first 8 or so years out of graduate school. And then my candidate for governor lost with my help, and I was unemployed. So I went back, I had done some journalism earlier to journalism, and I covered politics. And I thought that was natural. I mean, I was trained in that. I worked in politics and government, and I thought that would be a natural thing for me to do. And then when I hooked up at the New York, what happened was I worked for the Village Voice and New York Magazine, writing about New York City fiscal crisis and stuff, which was my first book, but also about politics. And then when Murdoch took over New York and The Voice, which is why he knew me many years before, I and about 40 other people quit rather than work for him. And because we thought, journalistically we didn't approve. And then that's when I hooked up with the New Yorker and also did a weekly political column for the news. And I thought I'd be doing political stuff. My first pieces, again, was Koch and then Cuomo. But then I got interested in poverty. I want to go to that planet. And then I got interested in Wall Street and wrote a book called Greed and Glory on Wall Street and got interested, in that planet. And then I just said, really interested in all these other planets. And then I did this book, Three Blind Mice, about the disruption of the television business. And then Tina Brown came along with this, with this offer, and then it wound up being analyst of communication. And I'm not tired of doing it. I think there's so much change that you don't feel stale in doing it. My wife, any number of times, has said to me, don't you want to do something else, or go back to write about Wall Street or something? And I say, no, I don't. I think it's such, following this world and the changes that are taking place, and we've just talked about some of them tonight, they're enthralling. I mean, journalism, what happens, television, what happens, the internet, what happens, what's a monopoly. These are all big, juicy, not easily answerable questions.
Excellent. Questions from the audience? Any hands going up? Because I can continue with questions here for some time. Yes, sir, right here. Let's get the microphone to you, because hold on a second if you wouldn't mind so we can get you the mic and we can record this for posterity. You will be on the YouTube channel in just a few weeks.
I hear that the New Yorker is going to a bi-monthly instead of a weekly.
New York Magazine is.
Do I see?
Not the
Well, I
New
have that wrong. I was going to ask your opinion on that, but that's what I thought.
Well, I would like your opinion on that. If he doesn't, I would.
I would be unhappy. But you know, all these, I don't see any evidence of that happening. But all of these, magazines and newspaper, print is troubled. It's challenged for so many reasons, including the reason of the digital competition. And so advertisers have more places to put their money, which means less advertising revenue for magazines and newspapers. And people are accessing news on their mobile phones and other devices, which means fewer people are buying newspapers. And so these are challenges for all of us. But the New Yorker is profitable today. It doesn't publish 52 weeks a year, even though it's a weekly. It probably, with special issues, they do double issues, probably, I'm guessing, I don't know the exact number, but I would think it's closer to 46 issues or 45 issues a year.
Another question from the audience. Yes, please. So let's get you the mic. Race down the way here.
In the front.
Right here. The front is very popular.
Thank you. What you were just speaking about in terms of news organizations coping with a loss in advertising, I'm curious to know, do you think in order to stay profitable, should news organizations try to find some way to, I don't know, perhaps become a little more independent of advertisers, or at least try not to depend on advertisers so much for revenue, if that's even possible? What do you think?
It is possible. It's happened, actually. Newspapers were once roughly 80% reliant on advertising, and the New York Times today is only roughly 50% reliant on advertising. The New York Times has one advantage, as the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times also have, or the Economist have, or the New Yorker has. Quality publications have more flexibility to raise prices. So one of the reasons why the Times is less reliant on advertising today and more reliant on circulation revenue is that they've raised the price. And the New Yorker's raised its price, Wall Street Journal has raised its price, and that's a hopeful sign. But most newspapers can't raise their price without losing circulation, and that's the real problem. But if you can figure out how to make money digitally, and by the way, newspapers are doing, you know, it's not just the digital newspaper or digital magazine. You've got other things. You get paid by some of these digital platforms compensate you for, right? Many newspapers and magazines are running conferences. Some of them are selling, like The Guardian is selling T-shirts and other things. Some of them are doing, you know, ongoing dialogues, and they charge people to do it. So newspapers and magazines are desperately trying to figure out how to become less reliant on advertising and how to create other streams of revenue, just as broadcast television succeeded in creating these multiple streams. But now those multiple streams have some threat to them too. So the world is changing. There is no one, including people at Google, who are comfortable. If they're comfortable, they're crazy. Because the truth of the matter, if you look at Facebook paying $2 billion for this company that has no revenue today, or $19 billion for WhatsApp, you know, a company that has no revenue, they're doing it because they are anxious about where the world is going. Am I going to lose Facebook customers, viewers, participants to some of these other, to the app world? So we have to get into that world. But they also do it because they're paranoid that if I don't pay that money, will Google or Apple or one of my competitors? So everyone is scared. And that is great in many ways. But it's not very comfortable if you don't want to have an ulcer.
Great for a journalist, though, covering it.
Great for a journalist covering it.
Woman right here in purple, if you wouldn't. Thank you.
One of the news organizations that does appear to be expanding is NPR. And I wonder, is there a nonprofit model for newspapers?
Well, there is a nonprofit model for newspapers. we talked about Pierre Omidyar, who's doing that as a nonprofit effort. He's invested. Well, the question is, can you find a sugar daddy who basically will say, you know, I believe it's important that the public have a great newspaper or magazine or television, and I am willing to support it whether it makes money or not. And you know, some people said, well, if the New York Times gets in trouble, maybe Bloomberg would buy it and would do that as a kind of a philanthropic effort. The Times has made it very clear they don't intend to sell. But is there a point at which the Times may be forced to sell? Yes, there is.
And by the way, money is very tight in public radio right now. And
It is, that's
NPR's future and ability to grow is very much in doubt. They're scrambling at NPR to raise new kinds of money, and it's not a simple matter at all. Government funding, which was never enormous, is going to be decreased. So nobody in that world is comfortable either.
Absolutely right.
In some very similar ways. Next question, all the way in the back, please.
I had the same, is this on?
Yes. You're on.
I had the same question about a nonprofit, but I wanted to phrase it differently in a hypothetical. Why do you think that there hasn't been more exploration of the model of nonprofit that a university is, with a very diversified revenue structure that includes earned revenue from tuition and then lots of philanthropic sources? It seems to me that that would fit a large newspaper very well. You have a you have a firewall. Your scholarship and teaching is totally independent of your funders, and yet you can earn revenue. It seems to me that a lot of people in newspapers assume that you'd have no advertising, which isn't true, or they assume that the Attorney General's office would say you can't do anything political, which also isn't really true. So just why hasn't it been more seriously looked at?
Let me be sure I understand your question. You're saying, why hasn't a partnership between universities and newspapers?
No, the idea of a nonprofit model for a large newspaper, hypothetically, but that's more like the model that we know from colleges and universities and cultural nonprofits.
But then the question is, if you're nonprofit, who's going to pay for the deficit?
Well, just like any college or university has a very diversified revenue structure.
No, but if I have a staff of just 100 people, who's going to pay for that staff? I'm a nonprofit. Where does the money come from to pay for the staff and to put out the newspaper?
It comes from your revenues,
My revenue.
Your earned revenue, such as tuition. It's like a symphony orchestra. You have a very highly paid staff of professional.
But nobody puts out a newspaper on a nonprofit model is part of the question. And
that's right.
You could still have revenue coming in, and break even would be satisfactory. And to the extent you were short, you'd have foundation money. And there are many ways to consider this.
No, but that's the argument. I mean, ProPublica does this. It's a nonprofit model. Pierre Omidyar's new venture is a nonprofit model. And so there are people who do that. I think Global Post, which does international news, is basically a nonprofit model. So there is some evidence of that, and you may find that some people, like Pierre Omidyar, who's philanthropic, may say, a rich person may say, I want to support this, whether it makes a profit or not, or I'll create it as a nonprofit.
And in fact, Bezos hasn't really let us know anything about how important profitability is to him. He seems clear he'd like to limit losses, but I would assume he'd be happy making $1.50 a year on his newspaper.
Yeah, I just think he sees it as a petri dish. I actually tried to profile him doing the Washington Post and follow that, what he was up to, but you can't get in the door with Jeff Bezos. He's very, very private.
Another question or two before we break. Frank. Hold on for the mic, Frank, just a second.
Talk about Vice, which is now kind of a favorite of the younger generation.
Right. Vice is a Brooklyn-based company that has, as you know, a magazine on HBO now. An online effort. They do documentaries, they do music, they're very hot. Rupert Murdoch's company, News Corp, bought a small piece of it.
Started as a magazine, a print magazine?
Started as a print magazine. Canadians started it. It's a very, they're the people who sent Dennis Rodman to North Korea. and did a documentary on that. And they've done a number of very interesting documentaries. But they are hot, and they are reaching, they have YouTube channels. They are reaching a young audience, which is much coveted by advertisers who believe that if you're over 30, you've already decided what toothpaste you're going to buy, and you're not open, you're not susceptible to new new ads. So it's done very well.
And they found a voice of a way to get to the young, which
Yeah.
from an editorial point of view is interesting and exciting, right?
It's very, they're very anti-establishment, very, they have lots of attitude, and lots of humor, and lots of who cares, and it's popular.
Sounds like there's a great Ken Auletta story in Vice at some point.
Actually, we did. The New Yorker did a story
Right,
on
I remember.
Vice,
Yeah.
but I know them and have talked to them, and they're an interesting, vibrant company.
One or two more before we break. In the back, Mark, if you could slide the mic all the way over to Professor Rosenwig here. Yes, Professor Rosenwig.
Gentlemen, I just wanted to find out why Mr. Murdoch won't speak with you, and is it now a slam dunk that his sons will end up running his companies?
I actually blogged about the Murdoch announcement yesterday. The New Yorker editor called and said, would you just write a blog? So I said, I'm not going to blog about what this means in terms of sons, because it's obvious it means that he's planned a succession there. It's not clear which of the two sons will run, and actually by splitting his company, which he did last year in two, into a print side mostly and a television side, there are basically four positions you could have. You could be chairman of each, and you could be CEO of each. So it's not at all clear that, I saw some press interpretations was that Lachlan Murdoch, who is the executive chairman but is not full-time, might be the heir, and that James, who is actually becoming the co-COO, would not be. Actually, I think it reads that James has much more responsibility in the company than Lachlan, the oldest son, does. But you could imagine that Lachlan, who cares more about newspapers, and James, who cares more about television, they could each have their own company to have. But the missing person in this was Elizabeth, the daughter, who is the eldest of those three children. Murdoch has a daughter from her first marriage, and he has two young daughters, pre-teenagers, from his third marriage, which he's just been divorced from that wife. But the Elizabeth is very successful, and many people think she's the real deal. I profiled her last year in the magazine. Her father was so irate that she talked to me that he stopped talking to her, and doesn't talk. Actually, at one point visited her to tell her she should divorce. This is before the article. At one point visited her and said, you should divorce Matthew, her husband. Matthew Freud, who was the grandson of Sigmund Freud and a very successful public relations executive in London, who he felt was poisoning the well about News Corp. And then what she did, which I wrote about, she took a very public posture that the hacking scandal was a great embarrassment to News Corp and her father, and that he should speak more forcefully and actually should remove her brother James from running the newspapers in England because he had not taken action. But he didn't talk to me. He stopped talking to me in '95 after the piece because, all the talk about how these people don't care about what's written about them or said about them. When we were doing the fact-checking on the Murdoch piece, I had to call him. New Yorker does this elaborate fact-checking, and then the fact-checker said to me, Ken, you're going to have to call him and get this fact out of him because he's not responding to me. So I called him up, and he said, I don't think I'm going to like this piece. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, people always say, am I going to like this profile when you spend time with them? And I always say, I don't know, because I don't know what you like or what you won't like. I remember I once wrote what I thought was a positive profile of someone, and they said to me afterwards, what do you mean I have thinning hair? You go figure. So you never know when you don't answer that question. But he then said to me this extraordinary thing, which was illuminating to me about how sensitive even people you think of as insensitive are. He said to me, I'm getting out of the country. I don't want to be here when this article appears. Rupert Murdoch, imagine that. I mean, it was just crazy. Anyway, he didn't like it.
So, last question before we let everybody go. The night is getting long. We have 50 students in this room who are thinking about various kinds of communication careers. Any insight about how they ought to think about that future in terms of their own career decisions and their academic life?
Multimedia. Don't just think of yourself as wanting to be a print reporter or a television reporter or a broadcaster or radio, whatever. Know how to be cognizant and aware and skilled at blogging, the internet, taking pictures. You got to do it all in that world. And the other thing which I think is important for any journalist, and one of the things that I think has happened that's not good for the journalism business, you watch people on cable television, and they have opinions about everything. And in fact, if you ask someone before an election on the air, if you watch someone being interviewed and you ask, who's going to win? They all have an opinion who's going to win. Why do they have an opinion? Because they feel you have to have opinions about things. And one of the key things I think, about being a good journalist is humility. And humility means that you don't have the answers and that you have the humility to ask questions. So if you want to be a good journalist, one of the things you have to come armed with is a belief that you don't have the answers and that you're in the business of asking questions. And if you're in the business of asking questions, you also have to be in the business of listening to what the answers are. People talk, I believe, and I think if you ask why do people talk to you and spend time, Murdoch or Gates or whatever, I think they do it for lots of reasons. Ego is certainly one reason they do it. Another reason they do it is publication. If I worked for the National Enquirer, people would not spend 5 months with me, right? But another reason I think people talk to you is if they feel you honestly want to understand them, and because you're going to listen and to them. And even if I had opinions about Murdoch as a journalist, he knew that. I quit rather than work for him. But he ultimately believed that I would give him a fair shake, and I think I did, even though he didn't like it. But I think the answer to your question, Merrill, is that I think all the skills you need, these many different skills to be a journalist, and not lock yourself, as I am, I'm a print journalist. You can't do that, I think, in the future if you want to be a journalist. But I think the one uniform thing for all of us is humility and learning to ask and listen to the answers to your questions.
Thank you all. You've been an attentive, wonderful audience. Thank you to the English department for throwing this event in conjunction with our school. Thank you to my colleagues at the School of Communication and Media for your great work in putting this event together with our English colleagues. And most of all, thanks to Ken for giving us an evening. Well done.